There are diplomatic victories that governments achieve not through military power or economic scale, but through strategic patience and the willingness to call bluffs that opponents assume will never be challenged. 1 minute ago, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney concluded a press conference in Ottawa where he announced that Canada would not be modifying its trade agreement with China in response to American tariff threats. The Canadian economic policy would be determined by Canadian interests rather than American demands, and that the infrastructure investments Canada was making to diversify trade relationships would proceed regardless of how Washington responded. The statement was delivered in measured tones, without dramatic rhetoric or emotional appeals. But the content represented something unprecedented in modern Canada-U.S. relations: a direct rejection of American economic pressure and an explicit declaration that Canada would accept economic conflict rather than submit to demands that compromised Canadian sovereignty. The reaction from Washington revealed something that most observers had not anticipated. The Trump administration, which had threatened 100% tariffs on all Canadian exports unless Ottawa abandoned its China agreement, had no effective response to Canadian defiance beyond repeating threats that Canada had already determined it could withstand. This is not how great power coercion is supposed to work. The United States is the world's largest economy, with the ability to impose economic costs that should force smaller economies to accommodate American preferences. Canada is a middle power, whose economy is 1/10 the size of America's, and whose exports are heavily dependent on American market access. The conventional analysis suggested that Canadian resistance to American tariff threats would collapse once Ottawa recognized the economic damage that confrontation would inflict. Canadian business leaders would demand capitulation. Canadian workers facing layoffs would pressure their government to accept American terms. Canadian financial markets would panic at the prospect of economic warfare with their largest trading partner. None of that happened. Instead, Canadian business leaders rallied behind Carney's position that short-term economic pain was preferable to permanent subordination. Canadian workers expressed willingness to endure disruption if it meant defending national sovereignty. Canadian financial markets remained stable based on assessment that Carney's economic response plan was credible and that diversification toward non-American markets was achievable. Most remarkably, American business constituencies that depended on Canadian inputs began pressuring the Trump administration to withdraw tariff threats that would damage American industries more severely than they would hurt Canada. The political dynamics that Trump had assumed would force Canadian capitulation were instead forcing American retreat. The mathematics of economic interdependence, which Trump had misunderstood, revealed why Canadian defiance was strategically viable. Yes, Canada exports more to the United States in absolute terms than the United States exports to Canada. But Canadian exports represent a smaller percentage of Canada's total economy than American dependence on Canadian inputs represents for specific American industries and regions. American automotive manufacturing cannot function without Canadian parts. American construction cannot operate at current scales without Canadian lumber. American refineries cannot process alternative crude oils without multi-billion-dollar retrofits. American electricity grids in border states cannot replace Canadian power imports without years of infrastructure development. These concentrated dependencies gave Canada asymmetric leverage, despite the overall size disparity between the two economies. Canada could inflict targeted pain on American industries and swing states while distributing Canadian economic adjustment costs across the entire Canadian economy and across multiple years through government support programs. Trump's threat of 100% tariffs assumed that Canada's greater dependence on American markets would force capitulation. What the threat actually demonstrated was that American dependence on Canadian inputs was concentrated in politically sensitive sectors that could undermine Trump's support faster than broader Canadian economic pain could undermine Carney's position. The political timeline dimension revealed another Canadian advantage that American strategists had overlooked. Trump faced midterm congressional elections in November 2026, where Republican control of the House was uncertain. Senate races in states including Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania all featured automotive manufacturing or Canadian resource dependence as major economic factors. Republican candidates in these states were already receiving warnings from business constituencies that tariff-driven cost increases would damage their electoral prospects. The longer Trump maintained tariff threats against Canada, the more political pressure accumulated from within his own party to withdraw threats that were harming American industries in swing districts. Carney, by contrast, did not face elections until 2027 at the earliest. He had political space to endure short-term economic disruption while building alternative trade relationships that would reduce Canadian vulnerability to American pressure over the longer term. The time advantage was entirely in Canada's favor. The international dimension provided Canada with additional leverage that American policymakers had underestimated. When the United States threatened massive tariffs against Canada while Canada was signing trade agreements with China, Other countries interpreted this as evidence that American trade policy had become so unreliable that diversification away from American markets was strategically necessary, even for close allies. The European Union accelerated trade negotiations with Canada, specifically to demonstrate that alternatives to American economic dominance existed, and that countries facing American trade pressure had options. The EU-Canada CETA agreement expansion talks, which had been proceeding slowly, suddenly moved to urgent priority as European officials recognized that supporting Canadian resistance to American coercion served European interests in establishing that middle powers could defy American trade demands. Asian countries similarly viewed Canadian resistance as a test case for whether American tariff threats could be resisted successfully. If Canada forced American back down, then other countries facing American trade pressure would be emboldened to resist rather than capitulate. The demonstration effect made Canada's confrontation with the United States relevant far beyond bilateral trade issues. Chinese officials, while publicly maintaining diplomatic neutrality, were privately encouraging Canadian resistance through offers of expanded market access and infrastructure financing that would cushion the impact of any American tariffs. Beijing recognized that Canadian success in defying American pressure would undermine American credibility in future trade confrontations and would make other countries more willing to pursue Chinese partnership despite American objections. The infrastructure investments that Canada announced as part of its economic response plan served dual purposes that revealed sophisticated strategic thinking. Immediately, they provided economic stimulus that would offset job losses if American tariffs were imposed. But longer term, they created permanent capacity for redirecting Canadian trade away from American markets toward Pacific and Arctic routes that connected directly to Asian buyers. The Port of Churchill expansion, the Prince Rupert development, and the rail infrastructure connecting prairie provinces to non-American shipping routes all represented investments that would take years to complete, but would fundamentally reduce Canadian dependence on American market access. Even if Trump withdrew his tariff threats, these infrastructure projects would proceed because they served Canadian interests regardless of American trade policy. The messaging was clear. Canada was not simply resisting American pressure on the current issue. Canada was restructuring its economy to ensure that future American pressure would be less effective. Trump's tariff threats were accelerating exactly the Canadian independence that American policy should have been trying to prevent. The corporate response revealed how quickly business communities adapt when they recognize that government policy is creating new strategic realities. Canadian companies that had built supply chains oriented toward American markets began announcing diversification initiatives aimed at Asian and European customers. Automotive suppliers that had exclusively served American manufacturers started negotiations with European and Asian automakers. Agricultural processors that had sold primarily to American buyers began developing relationships with Chinese and Southeast Asian purchasers. Technology companies that had focused on American customers started marketing to European and Asian alternatives. Each corporate announcement represented permanent capacity moving away from American market orientation. These were not temporary adjustments that would reverse if American policy changed. These were strategic decisions driven by recognition that dependence on American markets created vulnerabilities that recent events had exposed. American companies dependent on Canadian inputs watched these developments with alarm and increased pressure on the Trump administration to resolve the trade dispute before Canadian suppliers developed alternative customer relationships that would reduce American priority. The concern was not just current tariff costs, but permanent loss of access to Canadian supplies that alternative customers would secure. The financial markets dimension confounded expectations about how investors would respond to Canada-US trade conflict. Conventional analysis suggested that Canadian financial assets would suffer as investors fled uncertainty about trade relationships and economic growth. Instead, Canadian dollar strengthened, Canadian bond yields declined slightly, indicating investor confidence, and Canadian equity markets remained stable. The market response reflected investor assessment that Carney's strategy was credible, that Canadian economic diversification was achievable, and that American tariff threats were more likely to be withdrawn than executed, given domestic American political pressures. Money managers were betting on Canadian resolve rather than American follow-through. American financial markets showed more volatility as investors worried about inflation from Canadian input cost increases, disruption to automotive and manufacturing supply chains, and political uncertainty from trade conflicts with close allies. The financial pressure was flowing in the opposite direction from what Trump's strategy assumed. The media dimension revealed another Canadian advantage in the information environment surrounding the dispute. Canadian media coverage was remarkably unified in supporting resistance to American pressure, framing the issue as defense of sovereignty rather than economic policy disagreement. Even media outlets that normally oppose Carney's political positions supported his stance against American tariff threats. American media coverage was fragmented, with business media criticizing tariffs as economically counterproductive, security-focused media worrying about alliance relationships, and political media dividing along partisan lines about whether Trump's approach was strength or recklessness. The lack of unified American narrative made it difficult for the administration to sustain public support for confrontation. The diplomatic communications between Washington and Ottawa revealed the extent to which Trump had miscalculated Canadian willingness to resist. American officials who contacted Canadian counterparts, expecting to negotiate Canadian surrender, instead encountered polite firmness that Canada's position was final and that the United States would need to decide whether to execute threats that would damage American interests as much as Canadian. Canadian officials made clear that they understood the economic costs of potential American tariffs, but had determined those costs were acceptable compared to the costs of surrendering economic policy sovereignty to American demands. The choice facing Washington was whether to impose tariffs that would hurt American industries and consumers, or to withdraw threats that Canada had called as bluffs. The internal American debate about how to respond revealed deep divisions. Economic advisors warned that executing 100% tariff threats would cause severe inflation, supply chain disruptions, and political backlash in swing states. Political advisors worried that backing down from public threats would make Trump appear weak and would undermine credibility of future trade threats. National security advisors were caught between concern about alienating America's closest ally and worry that failure to respond forcefully to Canadian defiance would encourage other countries to similarly resist American pressure. There was no consensus about how to proceed, which created policy paralysis that benefited Canada's position. The timeline pressure intensified as days passed without American action to execute tariff threats. Each day of delay made Trump's threats appear less credible and made Canadian resistance appear more sustainable. Market participants and foreign governments were drawing conclusions about American willingness to follow through on trade threats, and those conclusions were increasingly unfavorable to American credibility. Congressional Republicans facing upcoming elections began publicly calling for de-escalation of the Canada trade dispute. Senate Republicans from Michigan, Wisconsin, and Ohio issued joint statement noting that their states' economies would be severely damaged by Canadian tariff responses and urging the administration to negotiate resolution rather than escalate confrontation. The political pressure from Trump's own party created space for administration officials to explore off-ramps from the confrontation without Trump having to explicitly back down from his threats. The face-saving formula that began to emerge involved both countries agreeing to dialogue about trade issues while suspending tariff implementation, which would allow Trump to claim he had forced Canada to negotiate while allowing Canada to claim it had maintained its trade agreement with China. But even this compromise formula represented Canadian victory rather than American success. Canada would be negotiating from a position where its China trade agreement remained intact, where its economic diversification investments were proceeding, and where it had demonstrated that American tariff threats could be resisted successfully. The precedent being established was that middle powers could defy American economic pressure if they were willing to accept short-term costs while building alternative relationships that reduced American leverage. This was precisely the lesson that American trade policy should have been trying to prevent other countries from learning. The European observation of this dynamic was particularly significant. EU officials noted that Canada's successful resistance to American pressure demonstrated that middle powers could construct economic policy independent of American preferences if they were willing to diversify trade relationships and accept temporary disruption. Several European countries began exploring whether similar approaches could reduce their own vulnerability to American trade threats. The demonstration effect extended beyond trade policy to broader questions about American alliance leadership. If the United States would threaten massive economic damage to its closest ally over trade policy disagreements, then other allies needed to consider whether American partnership provided the stability and reliability that alliance relationships required. NATO allies began quiet discussions about whether American security guarantees were credible if American trade policy could shift so dramatically based on domestic political considerations. Asian allies facing Chinese pressure started wondering whether American support would be reliable, or whether they needed to develop their own accommodation strategies with Beijing. The strategic cost of Trump's failed Canada tariff threats extended far beyond the bilateral trade issue to encompass broader erosion of confidence in American leadership and American reliability as an alliance partner. The Canadian public opinion dimension showed remarkable support for Carney's resistance to American pressure. Polling consistently showed over 70% approval for maintaining the China trade agreement despite American threats, with support crossing partisan lines and regional divisions. Canadians were willing to accept economic costs to defend sovereignty in ways that American strategists had not anticipated. This public backing gave Carney political strength to sustain his position, even if economic costs materialized. The sense that Canada was defending its independence, rather than just pursuing economic interests, created national unity that would be difficult for American pressure to break. The historical memory dimension revealed the Canadians remembered previous instances where accommodation of American demands had led to continued American pressure rather than stable relationships. The auto pact negotiations, the softwood lumber disputes, the NAFTA renegotiations under Trump's first term, all created a pattern where Canadian concessions generated further American demands. This history made Canadians skeptical that capitulating to current American tariff threats would result in stable trade relationships. The assessment was that American trade policy would remain volatile regardless of Canadian policy choices. So resistance based on principle was preferable to submission that would encourage future American pressure. This is not a temporary, tactical success that Canada achieved through clever negotiation. This is a fundamental demonstration that American economic coercion against allies is no longer as effective as it was when the United States possessed overwhelming economic dominance and when allies had no alternative partnerships to pursue. Canada exposed the limitations of American tariff threats by being willing to accept costs that American strategists assumed no country would voluntarily bear. By building alternative trade relationships and mobilizing public support for resistance, Canada created a position where American threats became counterproductive rather than coercive. The infrastructure being built, the trade agreements being signed, and the political precedent being established will outlast any particular trade dispute or political administration. Canada has demonstrated that middle powers can successfully resist American economic pressure if they are strategic about developing alternatives and willing to endure temporary costs. History will record that Trump's Canada tariff threats achieved the opposite of their intended effect. Rather than forcing Canadian submission, they forced Canadian independence. Rather than demonstrating American economic power, they revealed American vulnerability to supply chain dependencies. Rather than deterring other countries from defying American demands, they provided a playbook for successful resistance. And the country that American policymakers assumed would always accommodate American preferences has proven that sovereignty and strategic patience can defeat economic threats when those threats are poorly designed and executed against adversaries who are willing to call bluffs that bullies assume will never be challenged.